Let's now move on to stress testing. This is a relatively new addition to the supervisory process. It emerged in the aftermath of the 2007 to 2009 crisis and has proven popular since. The goal of stress testing is to force banks to think about large potential losses. The goal is to ensure that banks have enough capital to survive a period of severe economic and financial distress. It tests their resilience in a forward-looking manner. How does this work? Well, there are several steps in the process. First, banks are handed some economic scenarios for the coming years. There is a baseline scenario. Here, GDP, unemployment, house prices, and so on continue on trend. Then there are adverse and severely adverse scenarios. Under these worst-case scenarios, the economy collapses. Banks will then project losses under each of these scenarios, and based on the projections, banks will submit a plan of action for capital. This means a plan for their loss-bearing capacity. Will earnings be retained within the bank or paid out as dividends? How much additional stock should the bank issue to weather the storm? This plan will be submitted to the regulator for review. This is usually the Fed, who will form its own projections of the bank's performance based on its proposed plan. Finally, the results of the stress test are disclosed to the public. Publicly naming and shaming banks has the potential to surprise financial markets. So this is an embarrassing event that banks would like to avoid. The Supervisory Capital Assessment Program, or SCAP, was the first stress test administered in the US. It was conducted during a financial crisis in early 2009 to evaluate the missing capital in the banking system. It answered the question, how much more loss-bearing capacity does each bank need to survive? This was a one-off process. It involved 19 of the biggest banks. These banks were asked to estimate credit losses for 2009 and 2010 under a baseline and an adverse scenario. The adverse scenario was a prolonged economic downturn. Unemployment above 10%, house prices down another 25%. Here are the results of that first stress test. They were released in May 2009. 19 banks, worst-case losses, additional capital required to sustain these worst-case losses. 10 out of the 19 firms were found to be capital deficient. The US government gave these firms an ultimatum. Either raise the missing capital privately by November 2009, or the US Treasury will provide the necessary equity and ban dividends going forward. Within 1 month, nearly all of these firms were able to raise the missing equity. Given the success of the SCAP, regulators have made stress tests ongoing for the largest banks. This is called the Comprehensive Capital Adequacy Review, or CCAR. It addresses the same issue. How much capital is missing in a worst-case scenario? They happen once a year. There are 3 scenarios. Banks are expected to forecast losses 2 years ahead, and they continue to provide a capital plan for Fed review and public disclosure. The belief here is that financial markets will discipline banks that fail the test. Here is the severely adverse scenario for the first CCAR. These scenarios were provided to banks. There were actually 28 macroeconomic variables. Here we can see GDP growth, unemployment, the stock market, and house prices. The solid lines show the actual path, and the dashed lines show the scenarios provided by the Fed. All of them take a turn for the worse in this adverse scenario. Banks submit their plans to the Fed conducts its review, and the results are announced. This chart shows the equity capital ratios under the worst case scenario. In the 2012 cycle, everyone passed except for Ally Bank. They fell below the 5% minimum set by the Fed. Okay, let's wrap up. Supervision is where banking rules and regulations are put into practice. Banks are examined on a regular basis. This happens both on and off-site, and in recent years, the largest banks have been subjected to stress tests. If a bank is somehow deficient, then an enforcement action may follow. The goal is to have a competitive and well-performing banking system that operates within acceptable risk limits.